son Charlie as the participant in this experiment, but there are some great little hidden lines in it. One of them talks about the pre-experimental training and the problem that they had with Charlie picking up and chewing and throwing stimuli and having to modify things. So we did a lot of things that were very different from a typical experimental protocol. So you see a little bit of that right here.
Okay. All right, you want to play? Let's play. This is the right one. Let's touch the right one together. You touched the right one! Yay! Can you touch the right one? That's good! You can play next, Shay.
This?
I'm gonna watch on the camera. Okay, now you get to try. Can you touch the right one? Very good! You touched the right one! Good boy!
Ow.
Right? So working with very, very young children, teaching basic discrimination skills, you do things like change the format of how you're presenting. Basic discrimination, this is straight out of the TARPA's first level, was a blank stimulus, and in the TARPA at the time it was this abstract black and white thing, but babies like to pay attention to faces, typically developing babies anyway, and so that's an example of some of the modifications that we used. So we made a lot of changes to those initial experimental protocols in terms of the presentation and how many trials and how to reinforce, and over the course of a number of years I went back and was like, I should have done this review much sooner. I would have not have made some of these mistakes because people have certainly been learning these lessons before me. The first one being that there's just a whole lot of variables that influence the assessment of derived relational responding, including motivation and instructional control. But really, it's about so much more than that. When we are viewing relational framing as an operant, that means that it's not some magical on-off, either you have it or you don't kind of a response. It, like any operant, can be more or less generalized to just a few situations or types of stimuli, to those more abstract black and white ones at the kind of highest end of generalization. It can be more or less fluent, and there's a bunch of other stuff that the stimulus equivalence literature has identified over the years, as well as some of the RFT literature. Using auditory and visual stimuli rather than only visual or only auditory tends to result in demonstrations of derived relational responding more frequently, which seems expected, given that that's at least for typically hearing and seeing children, that's their environment, right? That's how everybody is talking to them, is constantly, when you look at how adults interact with young children, it really is showing them things and talking about the stuff that's physically present. So it would make sense that auditory and visual stimuli together tend to be some of the first ways in which derived relational responding emerges, using task relevant instruction, which we would all be doing, but is not necessarily what was done in some of the early literature. The training format that you use can influence whether or not you're going to see a demonstration of equivalence or even mutual entailment. And this gets kind of mixed up in some of the equivalence work and RFT work on looking at what's called many-to-one versus one-to-many versus linear training styles, with the fact that if you're using auditory and visual stimuli, then if you're training an auditory to a visual stimulus relation, then you're training a listener and expecting a derived tact. That's what we did in that last little exercise versus training a tact first and then seeing a derived listener response. And so in general, the naming literature would suggest that you're more likely to see derived listener responses emerge having been taught a tact than the other way around. So you want to pay attention to that. Which direction am I teaching? Again, we want kids to get to the point in their repertoires where they can do all different combinations and variations of being trained in certain modalities and then tested in the other direction and so on. But at the beginning, you want to pay attention to exactly what level is the child in front of me at. And so then where do I begin? The number of new things that you're teaching is also important. When I showed you that first example with Mira, the typically developing 4-year-old doing all the abstract symbols and things, she had to learn 2 new relations for each of those stimulus sets. And that was fine. She did totally fine with that. But with a little bit younger kids, when we were first doing this, we were looking at training 3. And that was almost impossible for even typically developing 4-year-olds to get. They could get it, but it took lots and lots and lots of trials. So we reduced that down to only working on 2 new things at a time. And what you'll see in what I'm going to show you next, we actually only taught 1 new thing for each of those stimulus networks. The type of stimuli that you use make a difference. We did an example with a cup. Using things that are familiar and nameable and meaningful in some way is going to be more likely for kids to be able to derive relations on the basis of those rather than the more abstract stimuli. Again, we want kids to get to the point of being able to relate abstract stimuli very flexibly and fluently. But when you're working in really early intervention, you probably want to be starting with more familiar kinds of stimuli. And then the whole context for your training also makes a really, really big difference. And so when I set you guys up for learning what a garbledoof was, I gave you a context of going to a foreign place where you would have to learn a new word. And that probably immediately had you tap into some other kinds of learning situations that you'd been in where you had to do that. And I'm going to talk for a little bit now about this idea of context influencing responding in equivalence tests, because it took up a huge amount of my time early in my dissertation research and really taught me a lot of lessons, which is what my main aim is. My aim is here today to teach you. So when we look at context, if you're interested in reading the research, it's in the Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders from 2015. When we're looking at testing for combinatorial entailment or testing for equivalence, generally this would be one setup that you could do. There's one visual stimulus, an auditory stimulus, and an auditory stimulus. You can train the listener, test for derived tacting and derived interverbal responding, or you could do vice versa. You could train the tact and then test for the derived listener responding. And in some of our research, we did one versus the other. In a typical experimental context, you're just saying things like, which ones go together? Which one does this go with? What goes with that sound? You're using this very neutral kind of match to sample context, which is fine. That's how most of this experimental work goes. And when I first started out doing my dissertation, my first study was supposed to be a very quick one, haha, on teaching through multiple exemplar training, taking kids who could not pass tests of equivalence, giving them multiple exemplar training, and seeing how many kind of sets, how many sessions and sets of stimuli were necessary in order to teach to the point of now equivalence being with part of their repertoire. And so the idea that we had was that we were going to screen them with the TARPA, with all the kind of just basic black and white stuff, and then take the kids that screened as failing, that could not pass those tests, and then give them multiple exemplar training. But I wanted to do that within the context of something that was more motivating. That was kind of my big thing at the time, was it just needs to be more interesting and motivating. I think we're going to have a really hard time if we're just doing these kind of abstract things and we're just telling them to put stuff together. Like, I don't think that's going to, you know, make sense. It's not going to be something that is a fun learning activity for them. So let's instead put this in the context of animals and names and sounds. So have an animal, it's going to have a name and it's going to have a sound, and that's kind of the basic thing. We're just going to have cuter, more fun, but still abstract stimuli. And we're going to say, these are my crazy animals. And my daughter, who was 6 at the time, drew all of them. So they were just these randomly weird paint program kinds of stimuli. I'm going to tell them that they're crazy animals. And this one's name is, for example, this one's name is Mid, and this one says Jape. And then our test will be, what does Mid say? Or who says Jape, which with a number of different stimulus items. And so that was the idea. But then as soon as I got kids from screening, or they failed, right, with this more neutral context, into the game, a whole bunch of them, almost all of them, in fact, started passing in baseline, which was super interesting, but was super terrible for this being a quick first study for my PhD. And in fact, this took us on a whole new line of research over a couple of years, where we were fiddling around with what might be going on here and tightening up the experimental control a little bit from the first time, when it was just like, what's happening? All these kids are passing. And in fact, we ended up with a really nice, clear study that showed, you know, that just changing the instructional context, again, not changing the stimuli. They were, you know, by this point, they were all the same type of stimuli, randomized for when they were presented and which ones were presented with what context. And each of these data points represents a different stimulus set, meaning different visual stimuli, different auditory stimuli. So different animals with different names and different sounds on each one of these data points. And with a neutral context, this particular, well, a whole bunch of kids, but this one in particular could not pass. Put it into an animal context, could pass. Back into a neutral context, could not pass. Back into an animal context, passed again. So it was a really clear demonstration of how all of his learning history around the way things go together was influencing whether or not he was responding to tests of equivalence. And so on that basis and the other stuff that we were doing at the time, we ended up really changing a lot of what we recommended in terms of where to start and how to proceed. And we, in fact, ended up using real life stimuli rather than even the more colored abstract stimuli within the TARPA. And certainly the black and white was really just reserved for tests of generalization. So at this point, this is what I really recommend, is starting in a very, very supportive context when you're working with early learners, so that you can really see exactly where they are at in terms of having any repertoire of equivalence or naming, or how well generalized that might be, both to different kinds of stimuli and different kinds of contexts. When we can just really hold on to this idea that relational framing is an operant, and that it's going to be more or less well generalized and more or less fluent, just like something like imitation would be, this all starts to make a whole lot more sense. Because, you know, what I started to think about was just doing testing in these very highly generalized, with very abstract stimuli kinds of contexts, was like dropping a kid into an advanced Zumba class in order to assess their imitation skills. And they can't do it. And so you say, well, then I guess they don't have imitation, which is quite obviously not necessarily true. They may not have any imitation skills, or they may have some, but they're not that fluent, or they're not generalized to that kind of a context, or to group instruction versus individualized instruction, or something like that. So in general, unless I'm just doing essentially a very quick cursory check to make sure that a kid's repertoires of equivalence or coordination are solid, I'm not going to start with a really abstract context. I'm going to start with real life stimuli in a familiar context where I'm teaching one new thing. So I'm still controlling for learning history, right? There's no way that a kid's going to know that that lion is named Jack any more than you guys knew that the word for cup in Martian was garbledoof, right? There's no way to just guess that or get that on the basis of your learning history. So it's a solid test for derivation. It's just a very simple and very supported one. Yeah, so that's that at the coordination level. I'm seeing some questions from Megan about the TARPA. I'm going to guess that nobody has used the TARPA because it's not really a commercially available, widely represented program. Megan, I'm so glad that you have, and I have clients who do. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. Oh, and I guess I do have people in this talk that I have sent it to. So all of you guys who already know me have probably used it. And we are actually kind of in this long drawn out process of debugging it and working with the people at Hedgehog, Josh Pritchard's company that also published our book, to be a distributor for it and to handle some of the glitches and debugging and get it back into an iPad version. When I was doing my dissertation, I had to figure out how to navigate all of the beta version iOS stuff, and it kept changing. And then I finally, once I was done, I just stopped. But Megan notes that you just made your own materials. Yes, that was going to be my main point here, is that the computer version is kind of cool. And I actually had a client who had one of those Windows coffee tables and would run it on that with kids, which was like amazing. But you can do all of these protocols tabletop. The TARPA stands for Training and Assessment of Relational Precursors and Abilities. I did not make up that name. That was the name when I arrived. But it is just that. It's training relational skills, it's assessing relational skills, and it's not just at the level of equivalence, it's also at earlier precursor kinds of skills. And you can absolutely do all of them tabletop. And the protocols in my handbook from Hedgehog are all tabletop protocols that are what I use. Right, that's what I use, and they are essentially the TARPA in tabletop format. So I would definitely encourage you to, and those are free to download too from the Hedgehog site. So in any case, those are the protocols that I use, and I have used the TARPA in its computer-based form outside of my research, but I would say that with earlier learners, I am more likely to just do it tabletop because, again, some of what you need to piece out once you're doing things in a computer-based selection format is the selection of auditory stimuli may be a very big influencing factor in whether or not kids can do it. So it's a little bit better for kids that you're working on generalizing skills and focusing on auditory discrimination kinds of things. And otherwise, just take all those same materials, just like Megan said, and run it tabletop. So that's frames of coordination. And Ian, as I was doing this and getting bogged down for like years in these studies, including the one on multiple exemplar training for equivalence, which we finally did get done, Ian just kept saying, yes, yes, this is all great and this is all important, but to really understand RFT, you need to get beyond equivalence. And that was really, really true. And that, you know, it really wasn't until I got past just looking at equivalence and stimulus control and equivalence and how to work with young kids teaching equivalence that I really started to understand RFT in a way that I hadn't understood it before. Because RFT says that there are many different patterns of relational responding beyond equivalence. And when you start listening to young kids, well, you listen to anybody, but it becomes particularly obvious when you're listening to kids starting to do this, that this is what kids learn to do. And it's not equivalence, right? When my daughter and I pulled into the parking lot at Value Village and I wondered if we would find the thing that we were looking for there, this is literally what she said to me, and I wrote it down because I was sort of in the middle of doing stuff with this. This is not equivalent. This is not equating Value City to Value Village. This is comparing them. And this is resting on a whole lot of existing relational networks. And so it was really once I started getting into things besides equivalence that I started really seeing how to pull everything together in early intervention, right? So if we take this idea that there's lots of different types of patterns of responding, right? We can call them families, we can call them different frames, we can call them different patterns, but there's lots of them and they're all contextually controlled, right? And they're generalized operants. Then we can start breaking down those really advanced skills into the steps that it will take to get a kid to that point. And I'm not going to go through all of this in detail here today. This is really kind of more what my upcoming Praxis webinar series is about. But essentially with any pattern of relational responding, you're going to be starting with non-arbitrary relational responding and establishing contextual control over that, by which I mean, how do you tell a kid to find the one that is in that pattern, same versus difference versus bigger versus smaller? Those are all contextual cues for a particular pattern responding. We make sure that non-arbitrary relational responding is fluent and generalized across many different contexts and many different topographies of responding. So here's where kind of looking at making sure you're covering all your verbal operant bases is important. They should be able to tack the relation. They should be able to tack the stimulus that is in a particular relation to another stimulus. They should be able to select as a listener on the basis of a contextual cue for a particular relation, and so on. And then we're going to use that existing foundation now of non-arbitrary responding, still in a familiar context, to support establishing this next level of arbitrary relational responding. And then we're going to ensure that is established with appropriate both stimulus control and appropriate contextual control with multiple exemplar training, and is fluent and across multiple topographies, and just simply becomes more and more generalized to more abstract stimuli. So I'm going to walk you through this kind of sequence really quickly with an example of same and different. So hopefully it'll start to come together for you. So when we're talking about contextual control over same versus different responding at the non-arbitrary level, that's very simple, right? Here's an example that would be familiar to all of you and that you would be able to do without problem, just answering which one of these is the same or which one of these is different from the one in the middle. We can do that in lots and lots of different ways. Which ones are the same, which ones are different. We can get more complex with that, the kind of at a second level. Same shape versus different shape, same color versus different color, and so on and so forth. That's actually quite difficult. This kind of multiple component contextual control is really quite advanced for kids. We can do this with tacting a particular relation between stimuli. Are these the same or are these different? We could do that same exercise with yes, no responding, which RFT calls a relational coherence indicator, indicating that the relation between the items is coherent with what you just said. So are these different? No. Are these the same? Yes. We can do this with not just visual stimuli, but auditory stimuli. This is an example from a piano teaching lesson that I just found online, where you have to listen to what a bug says, what sound it makes, and then you have to identify if the sounds were the same or different. You can do this moving into things like pair matching, which is an early form of analogy that's actually at the non-arbitrary level not that difficult. This is actually a consult that I'm working with right now, where the speech therapist is working on this via PowerPoint, via distance learning, but teaching to match items that look the same with items that look the same, and items that look, pairs that look different with pairs that look different, and even moving up to things where it's a very similar set of stimuli, but they're different on a particular dimension, in this case, color. And so you can get very complex while staying at the non-arbitrary level. And what you are achieving by doing that is ensuring that the contextual cue for the relation, same versus different, is controlling a very well generalized repertoire of relating stimuli on that basis. Okay. I see Celia noting that the ABLA is out there, which, yes, I like that too. Actually, side note on that, my first graduate program, my master's program, was actually with Gary Martin, who did a ton, all the work on the ABLA early on, and I was actually a research assistant on a bunch of the ABLA studies. I think it's a really, really good tool as well. It has some different functions than the TARPA, but it's really amazing for its purpose. So back to this, though, non-arbitrary, we can establish lots and lots of pretty complex relational responding, even at the non-arbitrary level, before we move into arbitrarily applicable same and different responding. So what that means is that now you can't see or hear or smell or taste or touch why these two things are the same or why these two things are different. It's only based on some socially made up reason for these things to be the same or different. So let's look at an example of what that could be. If I taught you that Iris likes pizza, and I taught you that Kaylee likes the same food as Iris and Kaylee likes different food from Hannah, imagine I'm actually teaching you all of this and not just casually whipping through these statements. So I've taught you Kaylee likes the same as Iris, and I've taught you that Kaylee likes different from Hannah. You would be able to do a bunch of things, none of which is based on the physical properties of these kids' names or what they look like, right? For one, you'd be able to derive that Iris and Hannah like different food. Given the question, would they want pizza or sushi? If you know that Iris wants pizza, then you would be able to derive that Hannah would like sushi. Again, never having that relation between Iris and Hannah specified in our teaching, you would be able to do this, which is essentially a transformation of function test, right? Iris likes this, Hannah's going to like this other thing that is not that. And so that's what arbitrarily applicable same different responding can look like. And some of the studies that I did were looking at another version of the TARPA, where we taught that animals, we stuck with the animals after that first round, that animals liked that they liked the same or different from one another. And then kids got to pick which food they liked on the basis of those relations in that same kind of format. We teach you that these are the relations between them. Then if one of them likes a particular thing, what do the other ones like? And you would think that this would be easy for kids who know same and different responding. It seems really obvious that if the tiger and the penguin like the same food and the tiger likes ice cream, then the penguin will like ice cream. And if the tiger and the sheep like different food, then if the tiger likes ice cream, the sheep will like hamburgers. But I can tell you that I worked with a lot of kids whose teachers told me that, of course, they understand same and different, and who could do non-arbitrary levels of same and different responding. But they could tell me in one breath that the tiger and the penguin like the same food. And then in the next, having selected that the tiger likes ice cream, they would say that the penguin likes hamburgers, right? Like there was no meaning to those words. There is no meaning to those words. And that's really what an understanding of stimulus function brings, is what we mean by meaning, right? What does it mean to be different or the same as somebody in some particular way? So what that looked like, I'll just show you a little clip of it. If I can, let's see here. You're going to see we've got two of the pictures highlighted, and right now this young man is being taught to select if they like the same or different food, and then he'll get to pick which foods they like. Well, accepted. No, I'm not. There we go.
Same. Same. Different.
Okay, so now we get to select their food, okay?
Yes.
So what kind of food do you want the snake to like?
Ice cream.
Okay. All right. Do the snake and the owl like same or different food?
Different.
So what kind of food is the owl gonna like?
French fries.
Go ahead.
Right. So in that phase of this teaching, the instructor there is prompting to repeat what the relation is between them. And if he selected incorrectly, she would then directly ask him which one is the same food as the ice cream, so that he would then be at the non-arbitrary level of responding, or different food from the ice cream, excuse me. So again, I have protocols to do this tabletop as well, and I've had lots of people use it as a game with kids as well. And it provides this very familiar context using very familiar stimuli, but completely arbitrary relations. And it allows for this multiple exemplar training purely in the pattern. So on the next set that this individual is taught, there will be different animals and different food and different relations between them until he's skilled at deriving those relations and identifying what that means in the sense of which food they would like. And we actually did a little bit of a generalization test with just written out stories as well with this, and we let kids select what characters are going to go out for lunch, and then what do you think there should be on the menu, and then we would write out, well, this is the story. Cinderella likes the same food as Snow White, and Tinkerbell likes different food from Snow White, and then they would have to pick those. And we had really lovely results in terms of generalization as well once kids were able to do this skillfully, responding to the pattern, which didn't take that many sessions. They were also then able to answer these kinds of simple reading comprehensions where they were not able to do that before. So that gives you a sense of kind of the full sequence of looking at same and different in early intervention. Of course, this can get much, much more complicated with lots more stimuli, but that's the basic idea. Of course, there's not just, there's not just same and different. There's also all of these other repertoires, which some of the SMART training research in particular would indicate are very important to be teaching, that they're starting to see changes as they teach comparison and opposite, not just coordination. And comparison also has non-arbitrary foundations that can be very helpful when you don't speak a language. This is a sign for fines on the Italian metro, noting that if, in case you weren't aware of it, 250 euros is more than the €1.20 that it costs you to buy a ticket. But again, with all of these, we can do that same process of establishing contextual control over non-arbitrary relations and then arbitrary relations. And these are a lot of the protocols that we're working on right now for the second volume of our handbook. And so some of the classic work in comparison looked at essentially coin value, because if there's anything that's arbitrary about value, it's coins, right? There's no reason that a nickel is worth less than a dime, even though it's bigger. And in this particular study, they took kids, typically developing kids, and I think another study, they looked at a couple of kids with autism as well, and taught them these relations between coins as being worth more than or less than, and then tested with pairs that hadn't been paired together in training to ask which one of these coins would you like to take to the shop to buy sweets, or which one would you not like to take to the shop to buy sweets. And in this particular study, they actually had to go back and do some non-arbitrary training with kids that were not able to do this. So this is definitely a skill that preschoolers and kindergartners are on the cusp of, that obviously has some pretty important implications for foundations for math skills, and as well as, of course, just reading comprehension and so on. So we've got same and different and comparison, and opposite is another one. We can look at using physical items to identify which one is the opposite. So if I held up an empty jar and asked you to find the same, you would find an empty jar. If I asked you to find the opposite, then you would find the one that was full. But that's establishing contextual control by the cue of opposite, not the words empty and full, right? At the non-arbitrary level, before moving into more arbitrary opposite relations. And again, we can do that with listener responding. We can do that with tact responding. We can then cover up the jars and say, this one is the opposite of the green one. Can you tell me if it is empty or full, right? After having been taught that the green one is empty, and so on and so forth. And then we can uncover them and show what's there. So those are some of the earliest of relational operands. Spatial and temporal are also really important and kind of shift into a whole nother level, because it has nothing at that point to do with the physical stimuli themselves, even at the non-arbitrary level. It's just that you can see the relation in space or time. And so that's a bit harder. But then the other kind of major line of research that I've been involved with has been on categorization and hierarchical responding and class equivalence. And so there's a fair bit of work out there at the equivalence level on essentially what's termed category naming. So teaching to identify either as a listener or to tact both the names and the categories of something. Like a hammer, you would be taught to call a hammer and also taught to be called a tool, as well as other tools, and then tested for that. And that's really important, and a really important early repertoire of categorization. And it is just the first step of categorization, because when we look at true categorization, we are looking at hierarchical framing, right? A fruit is a type of food and a banana is a type of fruit, but not all food are bananas and not all fruit are bananas. And so hierarchical framing and true categorization involves being able to respond to classes as being contained within other classes. And one of the ways that we can assess for that and train for that is with what's called the class inclusion task. And this is a Piagetian kind of developmental task in which if I had, I'm going to show you an example of this. If I had, 5 apples and 2 oranges, and I asked you, do we have more apples or do we have more fruit? You would be able to answer that we have more fruit, because fruit includes both the apples and the oranges. But typically developing young kids won't respond that way. They'll respond very much at an equivalence level. And so if these are all also called fruit, it doesn't make any sense from an equivalence level, like that the question doesn't make sense at an equivalence level. And they will pretty much always answer you with whichever subcategory has more or whichever subcategory has less. So I'm going to show you what I typically developing 4-year-old, my daughter, she got to be the guinea pig in a lot of my learning experiments, how a typically developing 4-year-old will respond to this. And you will see that she has tons and tons of skills. Right before this clip, she's actually named the categories of all of the things that are on the table. So I know that she can call an apple a fruit, for example. And this, though, is how she responded when I tried to do a class inclusion task. Keep hitting her. Okay.
Do we have more apples or do we have more fruit?
Wow.
Okay, how many fruits do we have?
2.
And are apples a fruit?
No.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Okay, so apples are a fruit, right? So how many fruits do we have?
4 fruits. 4 fruit.
And
2 fruits.
makes...
6.
Okay, so do we have more apples or do we have more fruits?
Because 4, 5, and then it makes 6.
Uh-huh, that's right. So do we have more apples or do we have more fruits?
And she says, I don't want to play this game.
wanna
This
play
game
this
is
game."
too hard. And it certainly was. It was certainly hard for all the kids that we started looking at this with, but we did have some really, really nice results by taking an RFT perspective on this. How do we make this as non-arbitrary as possible? How do we, yes, Celia, her shirt says, don't bother me, I'm crabby. It has like a crab on it. So we taking an RFT perspective on this task means that the larger class contains the smaller classes. So how can we show that as clearly as possible and provide training in this idea of containment, not just comparison? All of these kids could compare at the non-arbitrary level, right? You know, she can even, you know, count and add simple arithmetic kinds of things at this point. So all of the kids that we worked with, whatever age they were at basically this developmental level from a language perspective. And we did the same work with typically developing preschoolers. What does it mean to contain something? Well, what we did was use actual containers to demonstrate this, and then faded the containers and tested for generalization. So I'm going to show you what that protocol looks like as well.
Cats in the small cat box. Take the cat. Right there, 2 cats. And the dogs in the small dog box.
2.
Okay, put the dogs in the small dog box. Nice work. Okay, cats and dogs are types of animals, so they go inside the animal category box.
I just want them close.
I know you like them close to you. Okay, show me the cat box. Very good. And now show me the animal category box. That's right. Show me the animal category box. Good work. Okay, listen to the question. Which has more, cats or animals? You are right. There are more animals than there are cats. Nice work. Okay, we can do the next one.
Okay, so like I said, when the baseline on this is really just with the pictures without any containers. We did a bunch of different categories and we picked animals to work on, and then faded out the containers, and we're able to get pretty immediate generalization to all kinds of different categories with this. Again, the lens here is what is the relation and how do I make that physically present, right? How do I make, what's the non-arbitrary level that we're working at? And so whenever you're looking at these more complex language skills, taking that perspective kind of opens up this lovely clear path for curriculum development. I think there was a question in the chat about responding that there are more apples because there's only 2 types of fruit. I don't know, like that wasn't something that we specifically tested for. What all of the kids just seemed to universally respond to was if there was, so if there were more apples, so if let's say there were 4 apples and 2 oranges, and the question was, are there more apples or more fruit? Then the answer would be that there's more apples, because that's the larger subcategory. If the question was, are there more oranges or more fruit? The answer would be fruit, because the oranges were the smaller subcategory, so they can't be the one with more. And so we had this really clear and interesting pattern of responding from that perspective for a good chunk of the kids, not all of them. So since we didn't specifically test for whether they were responding to, are there 2 categories of fruits or fruits? I don't know. It's possible. It's totally possible. So in any case, that's kind of at the categorization level. And when I started doing this work, thinking about categorization from this perspective really fundamentally changed how I think about teaching categories from the very beginning. If we are trying to teach categorization, then we should be teaching category naming as naming of groups of things, right? These are all animals, for example. These are all vehicles. And we should rarely and only as a generalization task hold up a singular item and ask something like, what's the category of this? Because that's not getting at what categories are about. Categories are about groupings and groupings within groupings. And so even though class inclusion is a task that's kind of on the high end for early intervention, like this is more of a kindergarten, first grade level kind of a task in terms of where it would emerge without any specific training, but just the learning history that's involved in typical preschool and kindergarten curricula. You can teach it to preschoolers for sure, but we're kind of on the high end of things here. And so you wouldn't necessarily be doing this a lot in early intervention, but you do need to be thinking about how you teach categories, and we should be thinking about it with this end goal and a larger end goal of the truly arbitrary categorization, because that's what so much science, right? Science curricula is based on. So that can really help even at the earliest levels, is to remember that what am I teaching here? What is the relation that I'm trying to teach? It's not just that fruit is another word for apple, right? It's that all of these things are fruits. So keep that one in mind. And that research, and then we did a follow-up paper that just came out in JABA this spring as well, that you can take a look at. And there's a couple of other papers just out, or not just out, that have come out in the last couple of years that Teresa Mulhern did all of her doc work on this, on more arbitrary levels of containment. And so those were the main areas that I was personally involved in, but we can't really talk about an RFT perspective on EIBI without talking about perspective taking and deictic framing. And the RFT view of this is really the view of what it means to have a self-concept, right? Which is a repertoire itself. We can talk about that as selfing, right? When I'm able to observe myself from an outside perspective. And RFT suggests that we learn to do this by the way that we interact, by the way people interact with us around kind of I versus you, here versus there, and now versus then. I'm always speaking from the perspective of I, here, now, right? And I'm looking out at you there and then. And a lot of the research that's been done on this is just crazy complicated stuff that if you do any look at deictic framing, you will have read these protocols, right? You do things like where I've got a black block and you have a blue block. So if you were me and I were you, what kind of a block would you have? Or I'm sitting here on this red chair and you're sitting there on that blue chair. If here were there and there were here and I were you and you were me, where would you be sitting? And yesterday, so on and so forth. And it just gets all super complex. But that's, again, kind of like super high hierarchy. There are earlier levels of that. This is not developing magically out of the blue. And there are absolutely foundations in early intervention that we can be establishing that you're probably already doing a lot of. You just haven't thought of it as part of this thread towards establishing this sense of self. One of those is tacting private events, right? I can't take another person's perspective if I can't even tact my own perspective. So we need to teach tacting private events. We need to start with foundations for I versus you, tacting my own actions versus somebody else's actions, teaching self-monitoring, working on spatial and temporal relations. These are all things that we can be doing in early intervention that lead to better perspective taking and more flexibility in terms of perspective taking. And just like everything else, the way you teach that is with multiple exemplar training in the pattern, moving from the most non-arbitrary level up through arbitrary with physical representations of those blocks and switches between chairs and so on, and then generalization to other contexts. And at the higher level of this, there's some just lovely work out there that you can explore. One of the ones that there's a couple that I like out of that were Ruth Ann Rayfeld's students. One was with fairy tales, and one was with social scenarios with teenagers. And so presenting these very developmentally appropriate contexts for working on these kinds of skills. And you can see here that they seem really complicated, but kids can learn this, right? It's actually, in my experience, it's actually harder to teach some of this because you're not on the receiving end of the teaching than it is to learn it, where you're getting prompted and reinforced and you're going through actual training on it. But these kinds of scenarios, you know, kids breaking up and asking somebody else to the dance and how would they feel and how would he feel? Those are all really appropriate, socially and developmentally appropriate things to be working on with respect to perspective taking for older kids. And by taking an RFT view on what is this, right? If we want to get there, what do we need to start with from the very beginning, from those early levels in early intervention? And that's really what all of my work in RFT has taught me, is how to analyze this much more complex languaging with a lens that allows me to see all of the earlier component skills and foundations for those later skills in a way that allows me to see what the path for curriculum planning is. And that's what I just find so powerful and beautiful about RFT. And so just to kind of come back to my perspective on all of this here is, in early intervention, we really do need to be integrating everything that we know about behavior analysis. We need to integrate really good understandings of stimulus control and ensuring clean stimulus control, and establishing generalization of all different kinds, as well as establishing relational framing repertoires. And I don't think that we're gonna really be able to move significantly forward until we can take everything, you know, we can truly stand on the shoulders of all of the giants that are out there and move things forward in our programming. So in any case, that's my perspective on all of this. I'd like to wrap up so that we can spend some time really chatting and kind of talking through some of the questions that you might have. Celia, I'm waiting for Elle's work to come out too. I think that it will be amazing. I've gotten to see quite a bit of it over the last several years, but I'm really excited to see what her kind of final results are and write up. So with that, I'm gonna end the slides and stop my share, and we can chat about whatever questions you guys have.
Thank you so much, Siri. That was a ton of information.
I know.
It's a good thing that we have people can look back at the recording if they would like. So
Yeah,
I did
definitely.
change it to where you all can unmute yourselves if you have questions for Siri. We do have about 20 minutes. Feel free to turn your videos on if you would like as well. We had someone asking about how to access the ABLA. Or ABLA, however you want to say it.
That's how we always said it.
So we're trying to figure out how to make that available, because I guess some people are having trouble accessing it if they're not in the States or Canada. So we'll get that for you all. That's the only question I saw come through so far. So hopefully some of you all will have questions that you might want to ask. And if not, I always have some, so don't worry, Siri.
I figured.
I did want to make sure while we're waiting for questions to come through that we let everyone know if you really enjoyed this information. Siri, do you want to tell them for a minute or two about the course you have coming up? And I'll put the link in the chat box.
Perfect. Yeah. So I'm doing another webinar series for Praxis, Continuing Education and Training Praxis, CET, on kind of everything that we whirlwinded through today. So it's 4 2-hour sessions, beginning with a more in-depth overview of the nuts and bolts of RFT. So really getting much more into any theoretical questions you have about relational frame theory, or if it's new to you, I'm going to like walk through much more slowly what all of the properties are and things to keep in mind. We'll have a session on assessing and training for frames of coordination, as well as doing equivalence-based teaching. We'll have a session on programming for those early relational operands with same and different, comparison and opposite, and then a session on more advanced, more foundations for more complex relational responding, starting to look at some of the analogy and metaphor work, as well as what I just talked about at the end here in terms of foundations for selfing. So, all right, so I think we have some questions.
Yes.
Let me make the chat bigger so I can actually see.
While you're looking at that too, Siri, are you okay? I usually make a Google Drive folder, and I have that PDF file of your presentation at Penn State that has information about the TARPA. Is it okay if I put that in there?
Oh yeah, totally. And I can send you the slides from this as well.
Okay.
And yeah, if anybody wants access to the TARPA, just email me and I'll get you set up with that. Like I said, I'm hoping that Josh's group will get that into a more easily accessible format soon. But things got slowed down a bit in the last 6 months on that for unknown reasons. Okay, so coming back to the chat, Mary's got a copy of the ABLA. Let me just get back to our first question. At what point does the child move from learning examples of derived relational responding and applying it, and what that looks like? So essentially, developmentally, relational framing progresses from naming, right? Which is, if I teach you the name of something as a tact, you would be able to derive that as a listener, or vice versa. So our first example of mutual entailment is with this naming and the kind of explosion of language that occurs in very early childhood. And then equivalence in really familiar formats. And then that needs to generalize across lots and lots and lots of different contexts. So I gave you the example of animals with their names and their sounds, but we can see this in any, like, you just walk into a preschool and anything that you're talking about is basically a context for equivalence. So if you're learning a story about, you know, the gingerbread man, you could be learning that this is a gingerbread man and that the gingerbread man goes with all of these other characters, and you would be able to derive a number of different relations among them. But if you're interested in kind of some of the earliest contexts for derived relational responding, just looking at some of the equivalence-based teaching literature can help a little bit with that as well. So I hope that kind of gets at that question. If you're asking at what point developmentally we see the earliest levels of naming and equivalence start around 18 to 20 months, we start to get that mutually entailed tact listener responding or naming. And then at some point after that, probably in the range of around 30 months, we would start to see equivalence develop. We see non-arbitrary levels of relational responding to same and different happen around that same time. And then it just kind of all goes from there. Okay, let me get examples like the dog and cat bins inside the animals bin. So in terms of looking at categorization, the beautiful thing about relational framing is that it doesn't matter what you're putting in those bins, right? It doesn't matter what you're putting in the pattern. You know, it doesn't matter if you're talking about animals liking food or your friends liking different kinds of music or wearing different kinds of clothes or whatever it happens to be. The content of what you're teaching is totally irrelevant to the pattern that you're teaching it in. So if you wanted to teach categories that were not animal categories, you could do that, right? You could teach any kinds of categories. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I got at exactly what that question was asking. Let's see here. Celia asks about the peak. So I am familiar. I don't use the peak personally because I like making my own stuff, but I do consult to a number of agencies and other behavior analysts who do use the peak, kind of around problem solving and curriculum development within that. So I think the question, and maybe this is a question for Megan, I think that the question you're asking isn't necessarily answered by the content of what's in the direct and generalization modules, but how you are going about teaching that, which is, I think, a main focus of the generalization module. In terms of the emergence of more complex derived relational responding, what you're really trying to do is ensuring that you're teaching that pattern, right? The pattern that the word pen goes with this item pen and write goes with this pen, or stationary, or well, you wouldn't teach that in early intervention, but you know what I mean? You're trying to teach this pattern of things being equivalent to one another. So all of your LRFFC and interverbal kinds of webbing programs that you would have in a VB style program do that. They're teaching multiple responses per stimulus item that can then be derived kind of all the way around that. Let's see here. Megan, did you have more that you would like to say about that specifically?
Yeah, I would say that the direct, for me at least, the direct and generalization books don't obviously teach any of the prerequisite skills. I think for my own practitioner understanding, reading Siri's book that I linked in the chat was like, even though I provided training on peak for years, Siri's book is just way more helpful in understanding the framework and like the processes. And like she said, kind of learning how to set stuff up for yourself. And then the nice thing about peak, not all of us have time to like write programs that way all the time. So having, you know, a list of programs to pull from so you don't have to reinvent the wheel is helpful. But for years I had, you know, since my graduate program in 2005 at FSU, learned about relational frame theory and stimulus equivalence. And it wasn't until reading Siri's work that I was like, wasn't until peak that I saw it as relevant or important to what I do. And it wasn't until I read Siri's work that I was like, well, this sure would have been nice to have 12 years ago. You know, so if you want like an early understanding of RFT and like why it's important and how it develops in EIBI, especially, her book that I linked in the chat is super helpful, and hoping for future volumes to come out soon.
We're working on it. We're working on it. In the praxis course, I am giving out and presenting on all of the, well, I don't know about all of them, most of the protocols that will be in that book. So not kind of the book part, but the protocol part of that we should have developed within a few weeks, where things, you know, have slowed down for inexplicable reasons. So anyway, that was Celia's question. Logan asking about the perspective of self. If you want a really deep dive, a really deep RFT dive into the self, I cannot recommend this book highly enough, but you probably want to have a little bit more background in RFT. So if you've got a bit of a background in RFT, then this book is amazing. But it might be a bit of a leap if you don't. So also, of course, read Skinner on the self, on self-management, self-editing, on the self in About Behaviorism. There's a really nice chapter, and that can also kind of help set up a behavioral foundation. In terms of perspective taking and deictics, Louise McHugh's work in general is really good. So I think if you just look up deictic and perspective taking, you'll pull up a whole lot of her articles. Let's see here a second. Yeah, I third Foxy Learning as a great tutorial on RFT. Email me, Celia. I also recommend that book. Let's see here. Oh, sorry. The book is called A Contextual Behavioral Guide to the Self, and it's by Louise McHugh, Ian Stewart, and Priscilla Almada. Okay, I think I got through the questions that have been in there. Other questions? Megan, your questions.
Oh, mine are always like really interesting. So, well, one of the things that I talk about, or I started talking about at the end when I was still doing peak trainings, and I'm hoping to make a presentation on it at some point. One of the clients that I work with, he is a very rule governed, rigid guy.
Yeah.
And he had like pretty traditional intervention I shouldn't even say traditional, but very much like the VB interspersal, very quick, like rote memorization, errorless learning, all that kind of stuff before we started. And we've had quite a time getting derived relational responding to occur in like certain contextual cues. But one of the things that we noticed is when we're teaching him, you know how you always say that, or not you, but people in RFT talk about arbitrary stimuli are more difficult. What we found for him, because he has this, like, he's a one trial learner, which is great when you're rote memorizing, but not so great when you're trying to teach like same, different, and like things that change, right? And we did so many different ways of trying to help him like cue in on the right things, and it's been a mess. But so what we ended up doing was flipping it and focusing on using arbitrary stimuli to help learn the contextual cues. And he made a ton of progress. But then as soon as he had too many trials with the stimuli, so they were no longer arbitrary, or when we tried to transition to things that weren't as arbitrary, he had more difficulty. So I was just curious if you've ever encountered any clients like that, where they go so much off their learning history, like especially visually, he's trying to respond based off of his learning history instead of the contextual cues.
Well, and I think that's gotten at really the crux of those kinds of issues, is identifying like what's the interfering learning history here. And I think it's also helpful to be really clear in separating out kind of, are we using abstract stimuli in non-arbitrary relations? Because we can do that, right? We can use abstract symbols and ask about same and different in terms of their physical identity or physical dissimilarity, and they can be completely unfamiliar. But in non-arbitrary relations, or we can be using abstract stimuli in arbitrary relations.
We went full on.
And so what I think is important in those kinds of cases is just to recognize that if he has this long learning history, there's not necessarily a really clear, easily identifiable gap in that. Right? And so you have to do exactly what you did, which is figure out where are we going to make movement here and then do that, right? And so I have absolutely seen kids who have been in programming for years and years and years and years, and you can't really tell if they've been taught something or they derived it because they just know so much already. And so what I have tended to do with those kids is more of like a quick check across a bunch of different frames using pretty abstract stuff. So more like how the peak does their assessment, where you're just kind of getting a quick idea of where are some big obvious holes. And then thinking about everything else that really doesn't have anything to do with relational framing. It has to do with what are the behavioral barriers here, and where is this kid getting stuck, and why is not always about a derivation repertoire, right? And so you just have to be really good at thinking broadly about what all your sources of potential control are and kind of going from there. So there's no easy answer, but it sounds like what you did was, you know, it obviously worked, which is your data, right? If it worked, then that's what you should have done. But it does bring up this issue of how do you create contexts for learning that balance out that need to control for learning history with being familiar? Or how do you recognize when familiarity is not the place to start, right? Like I had a bunch of kids in some of my, like when I was first doing work in the with the TARPA, I had a bunch of kids who loved it with the black and white stimuli and the weird names. And I had one kid that was in my very first study screening through screening in the equivalent study, who 3 years later at a different school saw me in the hallway and came up and started talking to me about like Apps and Blanchy say, you know, whatever. And I was like, oh my God. So I do think that there are a lot of kids who have been in programming for a tremendously long time who just the novelty of stuff is really motivating and really valuable. So that was a very roundabout way of answering your question. Did I answer it?
Yeah, well, I was just curious if you'd encountered like situations like that. For this particular guy, there's a lot of stuff controlling, but most of his responses are controlled by his own rules, and like we call it doing things his way. So we did a program where we were, because he doesn't, when there's visuals and auditory instruction involved, he sees the visual and he just locks in on like, this is what I do with this thing, right? And he has like his response pattern. So we did a program with like sorting things, and we had a pile for like shapes and colors, but the items were shaped like a shape, so like a yellow triangle or whatever. And we would tell him like, put with yellow, put with colors. And you could see if you didn't like disrupt it enough before you even handed the thing to him, he was already locked in on like the shapes before he even saw what mom was giving him or telling him to do. So he had to work through that, but also his history with anything that wasn't arbitrary that he already had a history with. As soon as he would see the thing, he had his response pattern that like it did not matter what words came out of mom's mouth because he was.
And I think that's
the visual.
I think that's particularly the case when you are trying to do something where there's a long history of responding to sameness relations.
Yeah, that too.
Right. I even at early levels with kids who don't have a ton of skills, if they have spent their whole, you know, EIBI career doing identity matching, and you ask them to find something that's different, like that's impossible.
Yeah,
it's just impossible.
Right.
And so that happened all the time. So when I've done stuff like that. I've done a little bit like what you described. You kind of work on flex. You try to get around it and then come more into it, right? So figure out what are the things that aren't going to interfere as much. And so if he can do arbitrary relational responding, then doing that. But then also asking him to do things with non-arbitrary relations that are not the same teaching format. Right. So rather like, so if and I've seen this a lot. And so if you're starting from scratch, things go really nicely and you can prevent a lot of this. And I talk about that a lot in terms of promoting flexibility from the beginning, because you can introduce oddity tasks and same and different kinds of tasks quite early. But most people don't. But if you haven't done that, then rather than having, your match to sample format, find the same or find different, where the kid's just going to look at what you do and they're just going to always match it, right? You can do pair matching, right? Like I showed, kind of match the pair that's the same to another pair that shows the same, or the pair that's different to another pair that's different, where you're matching on the basis of the relation, not the exact things, right? You can work on tacting the relation as being same or different, right? So all the stuff that doesn't have a big long learning history that's going to interfere with what you're trying to get at.
Yep. And that's pretty much what we did. And we're just working in way more like flexibility and varied ways of doing things so that there's not
he
gets more history with that.
Exactly. And I think that's what we're finding with a lot of these kids is that, we've taught them a tremendous amount of stuff, but for some kids, it's like we sort of skipped the part where they have to be flexible. And so, that some of the stuff that I'm working on right now is really looking, and has always been, but even more so right now, it's really looking at how do we work from the very beginning in ways that are more flexible by teaching early, like teaching those non-arbitrary contextual cues for non-arbitrary relations a lot earlier. So you're not only doing sameness, right? And just being able to flip back and forth between some of that too. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we made it a minute past 6 o'clock, and I could geek out forever on this. So I will be mindful of your time. The overwhelming response in the chat was that this was incredibly helpful and educational, and people can't wait to review the information. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Siri, so much for your time. Hopefully some of you will sign up for the course that she's doing with Praxis and continue your learning there, or at least with like the different books and materials we shared.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody. All right. Bye. I'm going to sign off. Thanks so much, Megan. I'll send you the PDF of the slides.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.